picture of the Temple of Jubilee. I mean, I was just there. The buildings everywhere.
That's all right.
I know. I mean, these are just old photos. Really
Yeah.
old photos.
1913.
Well, part of it was copyrighted in 1909.
Okay.
And then another part was, I don't know which. I mean, but
What are you
Here's who it
discussing?
belonged to.
the Bible.
She was my great aunt.
I think that's Bible.
Okay. We are at a transitional point again. If you remember, back in chapter 5, he began that verse 11, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, seeing you're dull of hearing. And then he started into beating them up pretty good regarding how dull of hearing they were. And he's going over the basics. And now, finally, chapter 7, he's willing to get into getting serious about Melchizedek, about whom I'm sure you've all been deeply concerned.
Yes.
All right. But this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having not a beginning of days, nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Let's break this one down. First off, what's he talking about the slaughter of the kings? And by the way, I've got a number of commentaries I'm using to steal stuff from. One of them I found was almost irate at some of the modern translations which read from the defeat of the kings. He says, no, the word means slaughter. He was really serious about it. The incident is in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis, where, let's see, I'm going to try these names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kings made war. And they careened around the Near East, burning things down and stealing people. And among the people whom they stole was Lot, Abram's brother's son from Sodom. And they took Lot and his goods and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, all right, that his brother had been taken. So, and when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318. So Abram is not exactly poor. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, whatever that means, probably attacked from two different things. Caught him napping at night and beat him up. And he brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods and the women also and the people, so forth. Okay, so this is the odd part. I have not been able to find out what this means. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is King's Dale. The king of Sodom is not going to be mentioned again. Came out against him is a phrase that usually means came out to fight, but they don't fight. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all.
Cindy?
And then the king of Sodom and Abram bargain, and that's it for Melchizedek. Melchizedek vanishes from Scripture until the Psalms. However, he had become a very important person in Jewish thought in the last couple of hundred years before Christ's birth. Let's talk about this. Okay, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek's name can mean a number of things. You will remember that in Aramaic and in Hebrew and in all the Semitic languages, they all work the same way. Almost every word will have three consonants, and you're supposed to know what the vowels are that get stuck in there. It's not until very late, really, that you begin to get in Hebrew what are called diacritical marks, which are those funny little marks above the text. Those indicate what the vowels are to be. All right? And it's interesting why they did it that way rather than just sticking them in between the vowels. It's because of the scribal, the way the scribes work. And I've told you about this. The Masoretic scribes, when they copied a text, copied it precisely as it was on the previous page, so that it could then be read, it could then be checked by another scribe reading it backwards, letter by letter, and then be checked by another scribe reading down the first and last letters. I mean, this is a real concern. That's what one of the important discoveries with the Qumran text was that these very, very, very old texts were exactly the same as the much newer ones. Okay? Because of that. Well, that means you can't start sticking vowels in to expand it. So you put them up top. That's why the diacritical marks go up top. Anyhow, the three vowels that are used here are S, L, and M. Okay? And it was widely interpreted as meaning peace. And this...
You mean the three vowels in his name?
Yes, precisely. Yes, precisely. The three vowels. The three vowels, actually there are six vowels because it's a compound word. Melech, M-L-K, is the word for king in Hebrew. So that's why king of peace. But it can also be translated something about righteousness, king of righteousness. And this is the bad part. Remember, I said S-L-M, right, Salem? Yeah, well, there was a, there was a Canadian god named Shalem. He was the god of twilight, interestingly enough. I don't know of any other outfit that has a god of twilight, but they probably do. Anyhow, the Old Testament Hebrews were certain it meant king of peace. And since Jerusalem is from two words, Yareh Shalem, the abiding place of peace, and that was the place where Abraham, Yareh, abiding place, was the name of the place where Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac, but didn't have to. Now, it's not Jerusalem, it's somewhere else, but it's same word, Yareh. So Yareh Shalem is the abiding place of peace. Okay. Melchizedek is priest of the Most High God. Well, he's the first person in the Bible to be called a priest. No priest of any other type is mentioned prior to Melchizedek. This also was seen as very significant by the Jews of the time. Melchizedek was the subject of a great deal of controversy among various groups. You've all heard of the Qumran community and the Essegalia. Okay. They believed he was an angel. Okay. Some people thought that, some of them argued that he was a supernatural being. Some of the early Christians said he was Christ. Some said he was an angel. But it really doesn't matter that much, I don't think. What matters is his role. And there's a wonderful quote from Philip Hughes, who's another theologian, who described him as a primeval John the Baptist who testifies in effect, after me comes one who ranks before me, for he was before me. Which would seem, well, anyhow, I thought that was a good point by Hughes. That's how the early church is seeing Melchizedek, as someone who foreshadows what Christ will be and do. To whom Abraham gave a tenth part of all. We use the term tithe too loosely. Tithe literally means a tenth. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish law in Jesus' day had a lot to say about tenths, tithing. But it was not restricted to the Jews. It was a common practice in the engineering that a tenth part belonged to God, one way or another. And with the Jews, it was very interesting in that everybody owed a tenth of what they produced. And that tenth went to the Levites. Remember the priestly tribe that all the priests came from? And a tenth of that went to the actual priests, the descendants of Aaron. There are two ideas that need to be remembered here. The Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical priesthood. Aaron was the elder brother of Moses, and he was selected to be the first high priest. This is while they're still out in the desert, wandering around. Levi is a descendant of Aaron, the only descendant of only son of Aaron. So the Levitical priesthood includes all of them, but only those who would do. Sorry, Aaron was not the only son. I forget which son he was, third, I think. Anyhow, in order to be high priest, you're supposed to be descended directly from Aaron, but anybody who was a descendant of Levi, I got it all wrong. I'm sorry. My brains are not right. Levi was an ancestor of Aaron. He was of the tribe of Levi. No, that's what's right. I'm relying too much on my memory. I had problems with my computer. So the Levitical priesthood is all of them. But the Aaronic priesthood are the only ones who are allowed to actually go into the Holy of Holies, because they're the only, you have to be a high priest, you have to be a direct descendant of Aaron. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Without father, without mother, without descent. We're not, what this does not necessarily mean that he was a being created in any way other than other human beings are created. Think about what you've read in the Old Testament, particularly Genesis, but lots of the rest of the Old Testament. Every time a character is introduced, a major character, almost without exception, when a major character is introduced into the Old Testament narrative, they tell you his genealogy back forever with more unpronounceable names than you will see in a Polish phone book, all right? It's just, but here, doesn't say anything about who is, what his genealogy is, nor who's descended from him. And there's a double meaning here, or a double importance, really, not a double meaning. Firstly, that this is so highly unusual, almost unique. And secondly, Melchizedek is the high priest of the Most High, or is a priest of the Most High, without descending from Aaron. Okay? In fact, it's a long time, it's centuries until Aaron's going to be born, even. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. So now we're going to talk about that. The use of the word patriarch here is very intentional, because remember, Abraham is the one from whom all the Jewish people are going to be descended, as well as the Arabs. All right? So the idea of corporate identity through descent is going to be an important one in this chapter. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, sons here means descendant, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they meaning their brethren, not the priesthood, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're descendants. They're physical descendants of Abraham. All the Israelites are physical descendants of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them receives tithes of Abraham. Okay? Mm-hmm. So this is beyond the internal dynamics of, or the internal economy, one might even say, of the Levitical priesthood. And blessed him that had the promises. Abraham is wandering around because he's already been promised what he's been promised by God. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of meaning by the better. That's a little bit of an overstatement. It cannot be taken literally. It is generally true that the blesser is greater than the one who is being blessed, but it is not absolutely always the case. All right? And here, men that die, and that is precisely what it says. A lot of the modern translations say mortal men, but this is a little stronger, I think. And here, men that die receive tithes. But there, he receiveth them of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. What you say, witness that he liveth? Well, again, without dissent, we don't, but also without a notice of his death. We are not told in Scripture that Melchizedek died. That's why in Psalm 105 you have a priest forever. Because again, most of the significant the Old Testament goes a lot into who died how, all right, and where, and often even into where they were buried. And as I may so say, now, as I may so say, that's an odd phrase. It's not, given how emphatic the language in Hebrews is, this is a little iffy, okay? Levi also, who received tithes, that is, he received the tithes from the Israelites, paid tithes in Abraham. Because Abraham received tithes, Melchizedek received tithes from Abraham, and Abraham is the father of all the people of Israel. This, again, the importance of corporate identity, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. I don't know that there's ever been a society that placed as much emphasis on individualism as America used to. I don't know that we still do, to tell you the truth. The idea of individual rights, individual obligations, individual identity, it's extremely important in the classical historical American character. And that was something new. Think about the society of Britain, even as late as the 18th century, where you were born into a class, generally speaking, you stayed there. Mm-hmm. Your identity was very tied up with whatever community you were a part of, or whatever communities you were a part of. Just think about how many surnames have to do with occupations. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm a carpenter. Who's that? That's Joe. Which Joe? Joe Carpenter. Right? And this whole idea of corporate identity was even much stronger in the ancient world. The idea of the community in which you were imposing, whether you wanted them or not, imposing obligations upon you and granting you privileges was super important. And in the oldest part of the Old Testament, and remember the Old Testament was written over a period of centuries, one of the things that happens, one of the things that develops, is a lessening of this sense of corporate identity in terms of one's relationship to God in favor of individual identity. In one of the prophets, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one, there's a phrase that's often quoted, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. Okay? Everybody forgets what goes before that. It says, you heard this proverb from your fathers. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and their sons' teeth shall be set on edge. But I say to you, this is God's new word in the Old Testament. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. In other words, your stand before God is not just as part of some community or other. Your stance before God is you.
That is a big. When did this start evolving this way?
After the return from Babylon.
Okay.
I want to say it's in Isaiah, but I'm not sure. I got to tell y'all, my computer went nuts on me, and I had difficulty getting some of the data I would have liked. I've got, 12 books piled up around my chair. And it's hard that way. Anyhow, right. This is a very important movement in Jewish thought, and it obviously becomes even more important in Christian thought. Okay. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron.
Mm.
Okay, what he's saying is this. Well, let me a couple of background things here. One, the law. When we think about the law in terms of the Jewish law, we almost always are thinking in terms of moral requirements. What's right and what's wrong. But in the same passages, in the same book, where we see the law laid out, we also see the cultic rituals laid out. What were the sacrifices to be? What were the priests to wear? What were the priests not to do? What did God want in terms of our direct dealings with Him, meaning worship? So the law is not just don't steal, don't, whatever, don't do no murder. The law is also all the stuff that was done in the temple. That's also the law. A slight deviation here. All right, it's not really moral requirements, but it's cultic requirements. And the author of Hebrews, as we have seen so far, and I think you're going to see even more clearly as we go on, is much more concerned in this document about seeing the cultic law as a preparation for the coming of Christ, as opposed to, say, St. Paul's letters, which have very little about Jewish cultic law in them. There are some references, but a whole lot about what behavior should be within the community and within the world, what individual behavior should be.
Randall, could you say that one more time? I mean, the author of this is more concerned with ritual, with cultic
Yes.
law than, for instance, Paul was.
He's concerned with it, with showing it as a preparation for the coming of Christ.
Okay.
All right?
Can I ask also, just interrupting here, the laws that Moses came to, the Ten Commandments,
Right.
is that what was given to him by God, or were these other details and little cultic things that were created by man? I've always been a little bit confused about that because
According to the Old Testament, all of these were God's desires. And the Ten Commandments are foundational, but other things are built on them. The cultic requirements come, oh gosh, I wish I knew. The cultic requirements come while they're out in the Exodus. And here, in chapter 22 of Exodus, there's a whole lot of what we call civil law or criminal law, okay? If a man shall deliver unto his neighbor money or stuff to keep, and it be stolen out of a man's house, if the thief be found, let him pay double, all right? And if the thief, that sort of thing. And then chapter 23 starts being about a lot of that stuff. And then it goes into how to keep the feast of the harvest. And then it goes into, again, Exodus 23, thou shalt not bow down to their gods. He's mentioned all these foreign people. But thou shalt utterly overthrow them and quite break their images. And ye shall serve the Lord your God, and he shall bless thy bread and thy water, and I will take sickness away. And then, chapter 24, and he said unto Moses, come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders, and worship me afar off. And this is the giving of, this is an extremely important chapter, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Now this is not the Ten Commandments. And rose up early in the morning and built an altar under the hill and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. This is the important part. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. And half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. This is blood of the sacrifices. And he took the book of the covenant. That's what he's been writing down. And read it in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord hath said will we do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. You ever wondered why, even in very Protestant circles, there's a lot of emphasis on the phrase washed in the blood of the Lamb? This is why. Because the blood of God, the blood of Christ, is the blood that seals the new covenant. Then, chapter 25, okay, they have 6 days where the glory of the Lord abides on Mount Sinai, and the people can see the glory of the Lord, and okay. And then in chapter 25, it starts with, this is the pattern of the tabernacle. This is how the sacrifices are to be done, blah, blah, blah. So this is all God's word to Israel, according to Exodus and Leviticus, which is much more detailed than Exodus.
Okay, I'm devil's advocate a little bit. Jesus at one point says that you've taken all the traditions of men and forgotten mercy and justice and those things. And to me, the Ten Commandments, there's no question to me they come from God. But all these other things about the washing of the dishes and that, to me, sounds like busy work. And I have trouble accepting the fact that all those little things that come from God, they just seem like things that men think up.
Two responses to that. One, how can I put this? I'm trying to think of exactly what your formal words was. Sorry, it won't come. All right, second point. I'll get back to the first point if I remember. Second point. The idea here is the Christian idea. God has a plan for Israel. It is Israel, the descendants of Abraham, through whom all the earth will be saved. Okay, that's it. But what are they? They're a fairly typical wandering Near Eastern tribe. All right? And when they settle down, they're a fairly typical Near Eastern kingdom in almost all respects. And he is going to significant effort, it seems to me, to do things, to require them to do things which will set them apart, to keep them remembering, to keep them aware that they are set apart. First point, when Jesus says that, and I forget the precise point where it is, but he does say it a couple of times. Remember, the Pharisees had built a huge, what's the word I'm looking for? Had built a huge structure of finer and finer and finer and finer points of what the original commandments were. You all have heard me do this before, and I'll do it again because I know it. Commandment says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, and so forth. So then the question comes up, what is labor? Well, they come up with X number of categories of labor, one of which is carrying a burden. Another is travel. Okay. Then the question becomes, well, what constitutes travel? How far from my house can I go before I'm traveling? Or what constitutes labor? Well, one of the things is carrying. Well, obviously I've got to wear clothes. Does that count? No. Here are the things that count. If you're carrying blah and blah and blah and blah, or a tool, can't carry a tool. Okay. Well, suppose you're a tailor and you forgot and left a pin. I'm serious. This actually was a question. You left a needle, not a pin, a needle in your clothing, and you move at all. Well, you've committed a sin, even if you don't know it, because the law is an objective reality to set you apart. Now, those were all decisions that had been made by rabbis or teachers. All these finer and finer and finer and finer points.
I guess what I'm saying, at what point?
Well, you're saying you don't like it. That's what you're saying.
At what point do you say, okay, this is created by the rabbis and it's nonsense, and this part was in the Bible? Because Jesus himself talks about washing hands. He said, that you have all these things about washing hands and the things and washing the dishes and
well, if you want to know, read the Old Testament, read Leviticus. It'll go into great detail for you on what was believed to be what God had told them they could do and not do. And some of them make sense to us and some of them don't. But I return to my original point. The idea here was you've got this tribe of people who are not all that different from the people around them. And God has got a long way to go to prepare them to be able to give the response that they're going to give to the coming of the Messiah. I think I mentioned this before, that had somebody shown up in Athens or Rome and said, I'm the Son of God, they would have said, which one? And it wouldn't have surprised them, because after all, look at all the children the gods had, particularly Zeus. He was quite prolific. But the Hebrews had been prepared to reject that, to accept it or reject it on its own terms. The original Hebrews were almost certainly, and you can see this, it bothers people a lot, but it absolutely, it's very clear, were henotheists. They weren't monotheists. It was, this is our God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. It doesn't say other than me. That develops this idea that there is but one creator God. And it gets there reasonably quickly, but it does take some time. Mm-hmm. The law served its purpose. Its purpose was to keep the people aware of two things. One was their peculiar status as the chosen people. They'd been chosen for a special purpose. It took them a while to figure out what it was, but they had. And secondly, what I'm looking for, it served to remind them of their own impossibility of perfection, because they could not keep it perfectly. The Pharisees always get a bad, everybody thinks Pharisees are the terrible people. The Pharisees were the people who were trying the hardest to keep it. Their problem was they were relying on themselves and their own ability to keep the law for their salvation. They weren't really relying on God himself. They were in a bargaining position, I guess you could say. And, you know, as I've told you, there was a rabbinical saying that if just once every Jew kept the Sabbath perfectly, the Messiah would come. It's like we can force his hand, you know, or that's what he's waiting for. But I'm not going to deny that a lot of it seems very weird. And part of it seems weird because we may not understand parts of it.
Well, I'm not going to, I'm taking up too much time, but
Yeah.
Jesus says over and over again in the Gospel of John, if you love me, keep my commandments.
Yes.
And it seems to me if all of these very specific housekeeping things like that are coming directly from Moses, then we have an obligation as Christians to keep them. And as Christians, we throw them all off and say we don't need to keep them anymore because we're not under the law.
No, we don't. Because we're not under the old covenant. We're under the new covenant. That's the whole point of Hebrews. And that the old covenant, and he's talking about the ritual laws, but it would apply, whatever, have been replaced by a different law.
But, because he does get into the second paragraph, which I wanted to ask you, and I hope you address it, is that it does sound like he's throwing out the whole law in favor of the new covenant.
Yes.
Okay, so that means the Ten Commandments, not just the ritual, but the Ten Commandments? That's where I'm
He is
confused.
throwing them out as a means of salvation.
Okay.
Can I throw one thing in?
Please.
When does really the term come about? Not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, which goes back.
That is scriptural,
Throughout.
but I can't remember precisely where it comes
Right,
from.
but I mean, I think it's very true today with us being individuals versus a group. I'm gonna stop talking.
You're right. You're right.
I think it's in Isaiah, but it's the idea that you have all these little
right
housekeeping things, but you've forgotten the
right when
No.
someone goes down that list of whether it's the Ten Commandments and then on and keeping, you have to do everything just precisely.
Hebrews is going to address that.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
I'm gonna tell you where to look for it. Okay, we're gonna get to a place in Hebrews where he's talking about the law being written on hearts rather than on stone. Okay,
Huh.
and I'm going to remember Paul saying that the law was a schoolmaster. It was teaching. But we are called, if possible, to the degree we can, to go beyond the law. Here's a classic example of what I'm talking about. The story of the Good Samaritan. The rich young ruler says to Jesus, what do you say is, what do you say? Anyhow, he quotes, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And then it says that the young man, seeking to justify himself, asked, and who is my neighbor? Now, if you had asked the average rabbi that, the answer that you would have gotten would be something along the lines of, your neighbor is anybody whose house you can see from the roof of your house. Or your neighbor is anybody who lives within 300 yards, whatever number, they wouldn't have said yards, but anyhow, a certain distance. That's the way the Pharisaical rabbis are working, by defining the law. What Jesus is saying is, don't look to make it smaller, make it larger. Don't look to dumb it down to the point you can grab it and fulfill it, because you can't. And the reason you can't is because you're a fallen human being. And the church would take that and run with it, with the idea of Christ in us and we in Christ. And Hebrews will be dealing with some of this. Again, about just one more thing about cultic law. A lot of it that we think is trivial or weird or what's the word I'm looking for? Arbitrary is not. For instance, thou shalt not seethe the kid in its mother's milk. Gwen's smiling because she knows this story too well. That was a Canaanite practice for sacrifices. So what it's really, it's not about how you cook your meat. It's about, do you serve false gods? And there's probably a good bit more of that than we realize because we don't know enough about Canaanite religion. The law, not merely moral requirements, but cultic. And Hebrews much more interested in looking, no, brother, I misspelled that stupidly, in looking to how the cultic law points to Christ than he is in dealing with the civil / criminal type parts of what we call civil criminal parts of the law. Just as a little background here, there are a number of different streams in Christianity, and they're marked by different emphases. And one of the ways that people discuss this is there's the Pauline stream, the Petrine stream, and the Johannine stream. The Pauline, the emphasis is on salvation by grace through faith, and there's considerable emphasis on moral issues over and over again. Paul's very concerned about that. The Petrine stream, that is from Peter, the emphasis on the authority of the apostles, and especially Peter, and tradition and sacraments. The Johannine stream, the emphasis on the divinity of Christ and on Christ's self-sacrifice. Obviously, Hebrews falls much closer to the Johannine stream than to the other two. It doesn't mean that any of them completely ignore the others, but they are very different in emphasis. For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. And he's saying the priesthood was changed by Christ as high priest. And that means a change. And change here, the Greek word is much clearer than the English. It doesn't mean amendment. Okay? It doesn't mean adding something to it or changing part of it. It means exchange. That both the law regarding sacrifices, what is Hebrews 8, 7 to 13? Wait a minute. Are now replaced by what has happened with Jesus.
But
what you're going to hear in chapter 9 is, all right, here's what you do. In chapter 9, I'm leaping ahead to try to, we'll treat it with more detail now. He's speaking of Christ. No, wait a minute. Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed thee in the mount. That's a reference to what I was reading, okay? But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. This he is Christ. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them their God, and they shall be to me a people. Okay, we'll get to that in time. That's next week, if I live that long. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe. Now, he of whom these
But
things...
off what verse are you on now?
13.
13.
Of chapter 7?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. In other words, whether he means David or Jesus, doesn't matter. They're both tribe of Judah, remember? And they weren't allowed to go to the altar in the temple. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident for that, after the similitude of Melchizedek, there ariseth another priest, after the similitude, resembling. Ariseth. This is a specific word, anistemi. It means resurrection. It's the word, it does mean arise, just like, you just stand up. But it also is the word that the church uses for the resurrection. And it's, in whatever its forms are, anastis is the base of it. If you have Greek friends, you may have heard them on the Easter greeting in most Orthodox churches is still in Greek. Christos anesti, alethos anesti. Christ is risen indeed. You all know our friend Anastasia. Well, Anastasia means literally resurrection. Okay. So by using this particular word, and it's interesting because usually when a thing follows another in time, it says it comes forth from, but in this case it says ariseth. That he's talking about Jesus now, who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. Now, this is a very crafted sentence. The word carnal here, for us, it usually means something regarding sex. It just means fleshly, of the flesh. And in this case, you've got two sets of three words: law, carnal commandment, power, endless life. The contrast is between the law, whether it's whatever law, and power. That's a favorite word of his, dynamos. Power, the power in you that is put in you by Christ, the power to live a righteous life, the power to know that you're forgiven when you fail to live a righteous life. Carnal here is contrasted with endless. So carnal means mortal here. It's flesh. Flesh comes to an end. And finally, commandment is contrasted with life. It's not a matter of being dependent on your ability to keep the commandment. It's contrasted on the power of Christ himself to save you by sharing his life with you. Once again, we're back to Psalm 110. I think I said 105 earlier. I meant 110. For he testifieth, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For there is verily, he likes that word verily, a disannulling of the commandment going before. for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. This is this is a good, that's what I'm looking for. It's a good literal translation, but it can be very misleading in English. Disannulling. That is not a double negative. It is a thing that occurs only, well, it doesn't occur in English, but occurs in Greek. It's called a compound negative. A double negative is positive. A double negative, a double negative is a positive. A compound negative is an emphatic negative. And it is also, in the time of the writing of this, and had been for centuries, a legal term. And it can mean canceled in terms of a debt, set aside in terms of a previous legal judgment, or abolished in terms of law. Sir?
This translation in 18 uses the word abrogation.
That's good. Very good. Yeah, that's a good translation.
Are you referring to verse 18?
Yes.
Okay, mine has, it's a different translation. The earlier rules are repealed as ineffective and useless since the law brought nothing to perfection, and a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God.
Yes, that's what it means.
Okay.
I mean, that 18 and 19.
Mm-hmm.
But since what you're going to hear read, if you ever hear this read in church, will be King James, I'm using it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Martha, read that again so everybody can listen to it.
The earlier rules are repealed as ineffective and useless since the law brought nothing to perfection, and a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God.
Okay. Here's the King James for the second half of that. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by the which we draw nigh unto God. A couple of things about this. Remember, every time you hear the word perfect, remember that it's a word that has a lot of different meanings and can also mean complete or finished. Now, draw nigh unto God. You remember all that stuff I told you about the temple and how the Holy of Holies was where the high priest could draw nigh unto God, and only the high priest could? Okay, this is a temple reference. He's saying the law made nothing perfect. The law didn't finish anything. But the bringing in of a better hope did. By the which, in other words, by that hope in Christ, we can draw nigh to God. He went into he has, the veil of the temple is run asunder. And inasmuch as not without an oath he was made priest. There's a double negative. It means with an oath. And of course, he's referring to where where God swore to Abraham by himself. God swore by himself. The Lord sware will not repent, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. Remember, testament, covenant. That's what a testament is, covenant. The word surety here is often translated guarantee. That's a good translation. The surety meant that, and so it was a good translation today. What is sometimes overlooked is that it's a legal term. It's shocking how much, it's striking how many legal terms are used, both in the Old Testament and the New, to describe God's actions or our relationships with Him. An ingeros was a performance bond. It was something that would be forfeited if a promise or a contract is not fulfilled. It's a very strong guarantee. It's not like an election promise. No, it really is. This word, testament, it's used to translate in the word that in the Old Testament is covenant. Same word. It's the first time he's actually used the word in this book. Even though he's been talking a lot about the old dispensation, this is the first use of the word covenant in the book of Hebrews. And he's going on to talk more about the superiority of Christ and his unchangeable priesthood. They truly were many priests because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. Now this is, again, there are two meanings here and they're both legitimate. They could not continue their priestly ministry once they were dead, because they were dead. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. But also, remember, I talked about all of the strictures that were placed on the priests, things they couldn't do. Because if they did them, or if it happened to them, like an injury, they'd be considered ritually unfit to stand before God, even at the altar of incense. They couldn't perform as priests if they had physical deficiencies, or if they'd done something wrong, or if they'd seen, touched, or even seen a dead body, or mourned for the wrong person, for somebody they weren't allowed to mourn for. They were not suffered to continue by reason of death. They've come into contact with death now. They dead. So, yeah, that's a real striking. That's a pretty serious argument. If you take it, if you were a believing Jew and you really believed that the priest could not function as priest for the period of uncleanliness, well, they're finished now because they're dead. But this man, Jesus, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. The risen Christ is an undying priest. And what does the priest do? He offers sacrifice to make intercession for the sins of the people. Remember when he first started talking about the priesthood, that's how he defined it. That was their job. I mentioned that there were lots of other types of sacrifices, but for the purposes of his argument, the only one he's concerned about is the sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. Christ is an unchangeable priest with an unchangeable priesthood because his priesthood is perfect and complete. Any change would be a lessening. Any change is not only unnecessary, but there will be no change. Christ is what Christ is. And, here we go again, quoting from other authors in the New Testament. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Wherefore, because of that, he is able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. Save them to the uttermost. There's no sin beyond God's power and will to forgive. Absolutely and eternally, not just temporarily. The job of the priest is to intercede for sins. Now, a little sidelight here. There is a book. It is not in the Apocrypha. It didn't make it even into the Apocrypha. But it was very popular in Jewish circles at the time, called the Book of Enoch. And in the Book of Enoch, it says that, it's not scripture, I'm just telling you what people were thinking. It says angels also, the archangels, particularly Michael, intercede with God for humanity. Now, the Book of Enoch visualizes them standing at the throne of God, interceding for people on earth. Michael particularly interceding for the people of Israel. He's working overtime at the moment. Remember how Jesus went through how the author of Hebrews treated about angels and Christ's superiority angels. This may have been part of the background to that. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it may have been. People were really, as I told you, people were really into angelology at that point. The phrase, come unto God, he is able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him. Unfortunate translation. The word that's translated by him can also be translated through him.
Mm-hmm.
We're back to the temple again.
Mm-hmm.
For such an high priest became us. That doesn't mean become as in change from one state or another. It means become as is appropriate. Right? It's appropriate. A high priest who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. Okay, that term harmless in Elizabethan English doesn't mean what it means to us. It means having done no wrong.
Like innocent.
It's usually translated innocent or blameless, both of which are pretty good translations. Sometimes it's translated spotless and stainless, which is not quite, I don't think that's right at all. Undefiled means spotless and stainless. Yeah. The phrase separate from sinners I've had trouble with because obviously Jesus consorted with sinners all the time. I mean, he consorted with sinners that other sinners who thought they weren't sinners called sinners. I guess it means that this is my understanding, and I say this under the possibility of correction by those who know better than I, that sinners are not holy, innocent, and undefiled, but he is. Right? And made higher than the heavens. Okay, let's talk about the heavens. I would say that in our sort of mythic cosmology, we don't believe it literally, but we talk about heaven and earth. And we tend to forget how many, many times there are in Scripture where heaven is a plural. The heavens. Doesn't Paul talk about being caught up to the third heaven? Isn't that right? There were all sorts of speculations, and these long predate the Scripture. They go back to the Babylonians at least, and maybe farther. About, they were great observers of cosmic phenomena, and there were a lot of different ideas about the cosmos physically and what lay above. I'm sure you all know. The planets move individually. The stars, they don't, we're moving, and it looks like they're all moving in the same, so holding their pattern, but moving. But the planets don't. They move at different speeds and rise and set at different times, all that. Trying to understand this, people came up with the idea that the Earth was a sphere. Now, I know everybody thinks they thought it was flat. Most of them didn't. Eratosthenes measured the Earth with a shocking degree of precision. And above it were crystal spheres. And in these spheres, most of them were points of light. Now, some thought the spheres were blue or black, and there were holes, and there was a light on the outside that shined through, and that's what the stars and the planets were. But the idea was that the planets, the big boys, they had their own spheres, and that moved at a different speed. So here's Mercury going really fast, and here's Venus going pretty good. Boy, Jupiter is slow, but he's moving. His sphere is moving. You ever heard the term the music of the spheres? Mm-hmm. That's the sound that the spheres make as they move. All right? Some people thought there were 3 heavens. Some thought there were 7. They were all absolutely certain they had it right. But the point here is that where Jesus is at the right hand of God the Father. He's much higher than the heavens. And by the way, these references occur in Scripture. These multiple heavens. I forget what we call it. In Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Yeah.
Right. Were the heavens synonymous with the spheres then?
In some systems, there were a lot of different systems that thought about this. But the idea here is that the high priest that we have, i.e. Christ, has been made higher than the heavens. He's as high as you can go. He's with God. He is God. Right? Who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins, which he doesn't have, but they did, and then for the people's. But this he did once, when he offered up himself. You listen to the language of the Mass next time you're at a celebration, and you hear references to this. One perfect, sufficient sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. Himself once offered. And that is broader than Hebrews, because sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction. The satisfaction is the sin offering, but our offerings are also thanksgiving offerings, intercessory offerings. They're not just satisfactions. These are all translations of biblical terms that also have other meanings in English, but that's what they mean there. For the law maketh men high priests which have infirmity. Because all men have infirmity. We're all mortal. Mm-hmm. But the word of the oath, that's God's oath to Abraham, which was since, that is after the law, maketh the Son who is consecrated forevermore. In other words, that means it creates the Son, it makes the Son a high priest, the high priest. The old law was inadequate, imperfect, and temporary. It has been replaced by the new law. That is what you say. And that brings us to the end of the chapter, but it doesn't bring us to the end. I'm going to read a little more in chapter 8, and I may recapitulate it next week, but it makes sense here. Now, of the things which he has spoken, this is the sum. Now, here it is in a nutshell. You think, why do you give it to us in a nutshell in the first place? We have such an high priest who is sat on the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. Okay? And then he will continue on about what it means. What the important, what it means that Christ is the high priest who sat at the right hand of God, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. Remember, the original tabernacle was a tent. Okay? Tabernacle means tent, literally. One more little sidelight. You may have noticed that some of us are very fussy about trying, when we set the altar, when we put the things back together, to get the veil, and that's what it's called, to get the veil looking like that, front and back. There's a reason for that. The space inside there, where the chalice and paten are, should be a perfect cube. And these sides are designed to remind us the Holy of Holies in the temple was made to the precise dimensions of the tent of the tabernacle. It was a perfect cube. So it's a reminder of the link between the Old Testament sacrifices, which were preparations, and the once for all sacrifice of Christ. It's one of those visuals that I think for a long time, the clergy have really failed in our responsibility to teach enough. And there's so many things that we do, so many parts of the service that are ceremonial. Remember, in religious language, ritual is what you say, ceremonial is what you do. And there's so many parts of it that are ceremonial that we have not adequately explained. And we really should, because part of the idea behind Christian worship, particularly for many centuries, and not always now, is that the word is primary, but worship should engage all the senses. It should not merely be an intellectual exercise. It's not just teaching and learning. It's being in the presence of God. And we can never adequately express that, but we can certainly try to at least lead our thoughts in that direction. And the more you know about what ceremonial is, the more it becomes second nature. Nobody has to tell you when you look at an American flag, that means America. Because you know it, because you see it all the time, you hear it all the time. But so many of the things that we do, and some of them are very ancient, some of them are more medieval, so many of those things are designed to be a visual, among other things, they are designed, among other things, to be a visual reminder to create that sense that you are truly in a space that is not just a common space, and you're engaged in an act, the act of worship, that is not just a common earthly act. And so much of it points well beyond what it might seem. It's not arbitrary. It's symbolic. And I think human beings live by symbols and stories as much as by knowledge. Symbols and stories convey a lot of wisdom. Okay, not quite 9. I did well tonight. Maybe it's because I started on time.
A question about the altar. The Bible often refers to the horns of the altar. What does that mean?
It means the 4 corners. If you look, I've seen some of these. A lot of the ancient altars are square. Ours are not square. And they will have projections like that on the corner. That was for tying down the sacrificial animal. So the corners of the altar are the 4 corners. Thanks. So glad you asked that. I don't get off and get a chance to show off of that.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously done some serious reading because you don't see that much anymore, that term. But that's what it means.
Well, I was wondering if it was just, animal horns or what it meant. But
Well, no,
you're saying it's to
not,
tie down, that's very
Yeah.
interesting.
in,
I think the horns of the dilemma.
in Hebrew worship, it would never have been the horns of an animal because the altar had to be stone, all of it. And those of you who serve on the altar field know that our altar is mostly wood, but not in the middle. The spot where the consecration actually takes place is stone. Now, it doesn't have to be. You can celebrate. I could celebrate on this. So actually, that's crooked. I could celebrate on this if I had to, but it should be. It's part of the symbolism of being in touch with all the people of God before us. And one of the things that usually, and this is true of our altar stone, it's a flat stone, obviously, so it's flush with the top of the wooden altar. And it has 5 crosses on it, 1 on each corner and 1 in the center, symbolizing the 5 limbs of Christ. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. The continuity of the faith expressed through symbols, physical symbols and symbols of action.
Father, doesn't an altar stone supposed to have a holy relic in it, or?
Often it did, but it doesn't have to. But often it did because that seems to have arisen in the fairly early days of the church's life, celebrating on the tombs of the martyrs, which may also be why instead of a square altar or a round altar, both of which were common with the Greeks, the altar is almost always rectangular, which is like a sarcophagus.
What did you say? A what in it? I couldn't hear you.
A
Relic.
holy relic.
Yeah, we're pretty sure that there was a lot of celebrating on the tombs of saints, and even today. Well, I'm not sure about that. I shouldn't say that. I think for many centuries, people were buried inside the church building. And, you go to Europe and walk around the churches, and you're often walking on Bishop somebody.
Right.
Because they're just buried under the floor, out in the neighborhood. Being buried in a church or having your body deposited in a church was, not everybody got it.
Right.
I don't expect to be buried in Westminster Abbey. But Angelico is, So, yeah.
Speaking of symbols, can you explain what is the IHS on the cross? It looks like IHS.
It's Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, Son of God.
But
I'm sorry.
An S
No.
An S doesn't match on
No.
Greek, does it?
Hold on. Yes, it does. It's called a sigma.
Oh.
IHS is it's a contraction of the Greek word for Jesus.
Mhm.
Jesus.
Yeah. Yes. And remember, yes, exactly.
Okay. But it's Greek.
Yes. And people will tell you it means in his service or something like that. No, it doesn't. It's a contraction in the name for Jesus.
I haven't.
Father,
I-N-R-I, so you know very well.
Yeah.
Father Roddy, I'm sorry. Father Roddy said that it was like Jesus' monogram.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. That's good.
What language were the Ten Commandments written in?
Hebrew.
So Hebrew goes back all that distance.
Yeah. Hebrew is very, very ancient. Remember, by Jesus' time, the common language wasn't Hebrew anymore. Hebrew was like Latin is to us. Like Latin was to the 19th century. Hebrew is like proper English is to us. It's a relic of a bygone time. And but Hebrew is very, very ancient. And this is why if you want to be bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, you got to learn Hebrew. Yes, because that's the way you really read the scriptures, is by reading it in Hebrew. And it's one of the very interesting things that there were so many people in the diaspora in the early days of the Roman Empire who could not read Hebrew, that they translated into Greek. It shows you that a lot of the people in the diaspora were Jewish, but not as observant as the people in the Holy Land and so forth. You were saying something.
Well, I wondered, again, of the Anglican service here, I noticed during the service that you moved the Bible from the left to the right.
Yes.
And I just wondered what the reason for that is. It seems to be.
Okay. I'll tell you. Imagine, all right, here's the church. Well, here's the altar. Churches most commonly were built with an east-west orientation. And even today, doesn't matter which direction it really is, this is ecclesiastical east, this is ecclesiastical west. East is the rising of the sun. Right? That means this is ecclesiastical east, and this, the left side as you look at it, is ecclesiastical north. Sorry. This is ecclesiastical south to the right and north to the left. Envision the world of the early church. The world of the early church was centered on the Mediterranean. Remember, North Africa was much more heavily populated than, not more heavily populated than now, but it was, So, if you go to the east, well, this arose in Europe. If you go to the east, well, that's the Holy Land. That's where Christ comes from. That's the sun. All right? If you go to the west, well, it's just the endless ocean. Who cares? That's done. If you go to the south,
It's North Africa.
it's North Africa, but then there's just endless desert. If you go to the north, that's where the hairy barbarians are. Those are the people who need to be converted. It's taking the light to
To the west.
You will notice, Bill will tell you, when the altar candles are lit, the right-hand candle is always lit first, and then the gospel is carried to the north. We start the service to that side, which is, that's where we start. And then for the reading of the gospel itself, we move it to the north side. These things all have reasons. Thank you. I know some of them. There are a few I have some questions about. Ma'am.
Maybe you discussed this in the first
sessions that we missed, but what is cultic law?
The cult, to us, it's a pejorative, but cult to an anthropologist just means forms of worship. That's it. So when we talk about a cult, or when we talk about cultic law, it's the law of how you worship. And it includes everything from, it can include, and believe me, and for the Hebrews it did, everything from the words you use, the position of your body, who can do what clothes you are to wear. And of course, worship is overwhelmingly sacrificial worship. So it included what animals can be sacrificed, and how they are to be sacrificed. All that is cultic. It's not a pejorative at all, it's a descriptive.